We are nearing the end of our study on Hebrews, not close, but closer. We're in chapter 11, and we're going to break this chapter into two parts, try to get through 19 today. I'm going to read verses 1 through 19. I'm just going to ask for some general thoughts what this chapter is about before we begin. So Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 1. This is the English Standard. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it, the people of old received their commendation. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he had taken him, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and become an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him in the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, verse 12, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who seek thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Okay, so I don't know if it's fair to say this is the best chapter in Hebrews, but it's one of the best, one of my favorites. What are your thoughts? What do you see? We're going to just study through 19. What do you see about this chapter? Jerry, start us off.
Well, I see a lot of centered around faith. I see that we're probably ourselves surrounded by faith every day. We have faith in those that we drive down the highway that they won't run into us. We have faith in when we see a cat in the tree that he will probably not jump down in our hands, but when we have a child up there, that child is going to look and say, "I know you'll catch me, Dad, or mine," and it's going to jump down. So we're surrounded by faith all the time. So the faith of those prophets of old, and in the New Testament, read about the faithful apostles. We're just surrounded by faith. We need to trust in the one that is going to help us survive this world.
Yeah, very good. You're right. I mean, this chapter is all about faith and those examples that trusted in God. What else? John?
Well, back in verse 38, it says, "For the righteous will live by faith," and he's been developing this idea that judgment is going to come, those that live by faith. And I think, in my opinion, chapter 11 is designed to further define what that faith is really like.
Yeah. He defines it by human example, and it's very powerful. What else?
It's the triumphs that we have through faith.
Right, so it's not just about the faith, but it's about the triumphs, the fulfillment of promises through that faith. Good. Any other thoughts? Eric, or Lena and then Eric. Go ahead.
A synopsis of his major character.
Okay, so he's been dealing with Hebrews who are familiar with the Old Testament. It's a synopsis of those characters and their faith.
And promises.
And promises, yeah. Eric?
Verse 6, for me, I never really thought about it this way, but it's basically saying the lack of faith is really a rejection of God.
Yeah.
I never really thought about that.
Yeah, you can't please God without faith. So a lack of faith is a rejection of God. You become an enemy of God and the opposite of what he wants you to be. Certainly. Jerry?
And the rewards are great too.
Right. There's only one or the other. It's going to be either really bad or really good, but you reject God, bad consequences, but the rewards are so great for having faith and staying with it. Very good.
All these examples of faith demonstrate that faith is more than just having knowledge in your head.
Right.
It is expressing, doing, it is an action-oriented life.
Yes, so he defines faith by action. It's not just about knowledge, it's not just about facts, but it's about action. That's right. Jerry?
Well, God does respect those who have faith in him, and the compliments that we get from God in his writings, and, we see that today when we compliment another who has faith in him. So when we do that, we know that God he's saying, job well done.
Right. There is encouragement. There's a lot of things to lift us up when we're doing that job well done. So we could probably break down this chapter really easily. Basically, 4 major things that are emphasized. First of all, and obviously most of these are obvious, but great men and women of old, they believed in God and they endured because of their faith. But as John said, that faith is not just about knowledge, it's not just about belief, it's about obedience, it's about action. So notice all the verbs that are used are associated with their actions. Faith, so many people think faith is belief, but if you read this chapter, that definition completely changes. Belief alone is not enough. Rather, faith is only pleasing to God when it's working, when it is doing something. Every one of these examples has that in common. Also note that most of these saints, most of these examples were doing something that they had no pattern for. Have you ever thought about that before? I don't think I had. But they had no pattern or precedent for what they did. They were the first one. Their actions were based on faith in God, but they didn't have an example other than of others doing the same thing. So what they were doing was something new, and that's part of why they were commended by God. So what I find amazing by that is we don't have to experience that like Abraham or Noah or Sarah. We have their pattern, we have their example, and we are blessed and ought to be thankful for that. And then there is an emphasis all the way through that so many of these that believed in God believed in his promises even if they didn't receive them, or at least receive them in this life. Even if they didn't taste the actual promise while they were living, they still believed in God. The objective here is to show that faith has always been the means of perseverance in true religion. So notice he uses examples from all dispensations of time. And all of them apply to religion in general. It's not just about Old Testament, New Testament. It's about believing in God, following in God. That process, that faith has always been the same. So chapter 11 and verse 1 is one of the great verses about faith because it helps us define faith. So now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So help me break this down. What do you see here? What does this definition teach us about what faith really is? What is faith?
Noah had never seen it rain before.
Yeah, Noah had never seen it rain before. God said it's going to flood.
Had
No idea. He didn't know what that was going to look like. So you're kind of playing on those last words, things not seen. Trust is another good way to define faith.
Reality.
Reality. Now, Faith is is your say reality there? Now faith is the reality of things hoped for. That's actually a better rendering for that Greek word. That's exactly what that means. It's something not seen, yet we see it anyway. It's real to us. That's good. What else? Anything else from verse 1? So, there are a lot of different words in here, but substance might be your word that comes from chapter 11 and verse 1. This word has actually come up 3 times in Hebrews, sometimes translated as confidence, but here we see it in the English words assurance or a substance or essence, depending on your translation. No matter the difference in translations, though, what they do have in common is reality. Reality, the thing we hope for is real. That's really what he's talking about, is reality. And so that's a great word there. It has substance. Our hope has substance. Faith gave reality to what their hope was in each of these examples. You think about how Paul, he said we walk by faith, not by sight. We can kind of turn that around and say faith gives us sight. That's really what this verse is saying. Faith makes the unseen seen. It makes it real. So Hebrews 11:1 literally is, faith is giving substance to things hoped for. So to those of old, faith gives reality to things they had not yet seen, and so they treated them as seen, as virtually present. We might, maybe one of the better examples is 8 through 10. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go to a place that he was to receive an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going. He couldn't see it. He couldn't understand it. He'd never been there. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So for Abraham, it wasn't really just about the literal and physical dwelling in a land, but he looked to something that was unseen, yet he could see it. Faith is the reality and foundation of all our hopes. Without faith, we would be limited to a narrow world comprehended only by senses. I like that. Without faith, we would only have what we could see and smell and touch, taste and hear. And then we have the word evidence. Evidence is conviction. It is a sign. It is a proof. Full persuasion by demonstration of these things that are not seen. Think about Jesus. We today don't have the benefit of being around when Jesus lived, when he walked. We cannot see Jesus now, but our evidence of Jesus is our faith. How do we know Jesus is real? Because our faith says he's real. We see Jesus through our faith. Our faith takes place of physically touching Jesus. That's all we need is our faith. Therefore, Christianity is not simply a book religion, but inspired words converted into a personal faith, into a working faith. Now remember, these Christians were struggling with that concept. They liked what was seen. They liked what you could feel, what you could touch, what you could experience. All of that under the Old Testament. The high priest was visible. The sacrifices were visible, and you could smell them and see them. There were physical evidences of their system. They wanted that. They missed that. They were trying to go back to that. Therefore, faith is to be put in place of that. Faith is to fill the gap, to help them move forward to a system that is unseen in a lot of ways. Faith also serves as full persuasion that Christianity is true, even though not able to be tested by, say, the scientific method, not physical means. If we saw the end of our faith, like Abraham, if he saw where he was really going to end up in the end, if we saw the end of our faith, there would be no such thing as faith. There would be no need for faith, right? If we saw the end, then there would be no such thing as faith. And if there is no faith, then according to Scripture, there's no salvation, because salvation comes by faith. Things not seen. Really, this is probably the best way to describe this chapter. Things not seen. It's really a good title for the theme of this chapter, because faith in the unseen is what we see every time with these examples. It caused the men and women of old to endure, and as a result to obtain the promise and the reward of God. So it is these things unseen that sort of links all of these examples. So we'll kind of try to note that as we go through them.
Those people in the Old Testament were always asking, give us a sign.
Right. Yeah, and I remember the Pharisees struggled with that too, and Jesus tried to deal with them. But yeah, they wanted signs. They asked for signs, certainly.
But they did have prior knowledge because they'd known God had kept all these other promises.
Right.
So they had some knowledge and a way to trust God.
Right.
And for that reason, you know, it might be considered like a map or directions or something. One time, we were gonna go down to DFW, and my sister said, okay, now, when you get down here to Dallas, get off on this exit, go around to this one, then get on the airport and drive out there, and if you will turn left, you will be able to park right in front of the door. I had experience with her because I knew she could tell you how to get in. I did that, and guess what? Parked right in front of the door.
And I bet there were times through that drive you're thinking, I don't know if this is going to work, right?
Well, her dad would never take her word.
Oh, yeah.
He would only do the old law.
yeah,
He just
right.
went by what he knew.
Right.
But it's like that.
Hmm.
I think because I knew her, these people had some knowledge of God and the fulfillment of his promises.
Very good. Let's jump into verses 2 and 3. For by it, that is faith, for by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. So the faith being unseen, again, is kind of the title for this chapter. That's the thing that gave the approval to the men and women that he's about to talk about. And it is the Bible that is the witness that bore witness to them being faithful. So therefore we get to read about them and learn from their example. He says, by faith we understand. Every example through verse 31 is introduced this way. By faith we understand. By faith, by faith, by faith. The first example, though, I find it interesting, is not a person. It's not Abel or Enoch or Noah or Abraham. The first example is the very existence of everything. and there may not be a better example, and that's probably why he starts with it. So he says the basis of the material world lies in the unseen. Now all these people, these men and women, yes, they trusted in the unseen, but everything came from the unseen. To me, that's probably why nobody can come up with a viable alternative to the creation. The Big Bang Theory is the best thing people can come up with, because that still has to be made out of something that was there to begin with. And so the reality is, the only explanation is it came from nothing. God made it. And so he uses that as an example. It's not irrational to have that kind of faith. It's not irrational to have faith in something that's unseen. It doesn't mean it's not there, since it was the unseen that caused the seen. So that's why he introduces this chapter this way. It was the word of God that caused the universe. So it makes sense that Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham would have the same kind of faith. All of the examples are to show that faith, obedience, endurance will result in that which God had promised, even if you don't experience it, even if you don't live long enough to see it. You will receive it if you'll just trust. And then, of course, the author is going to go into example after example after example. We might think one or two would be good enough. Maybe it would have been good enough, but he doesn't stop. He just keeps going. Example after example after example of those of Old Testament history, which are meant to illustrate these first few verses, the nature, the power, the influence of faith. And of course, we understand the dynamic of human example is very powerful. The Hebrew writer knew that. God knew that. that he should be able to say things and we take him at his word, but we also need to see people that do that. We need to see examples, and it helps us grow. And so that's exactly what we have here. The author here selects very specifically men and women who not just had faith, but they excelled in faith. And not just that they excelled in faith, but they excelled in faith of the unseen. And again, that's sort of the crux of this chapter. And they still serve as wonderful, great examples for us today. Jerry.
When you said that it started out with faith not in something human, mankind that started out with the earth, the creation, kind of reminds us that all of our faith is built on some foundation. So certainly that's a good example, not an example, but it's certainly a good starter for God to tell us.
Right.
We've got to believe in this creation before we even go forward.
Right. I mean, and it just makes sense. We should be able to just wake up, just look around, open your eyes, and there's evidence for God. I mean, Romans talks about that. So yeah, it's a powerful example. Just look around. Why are we even here? Because God put us here. So verse 4 reads, by faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. So how is Abel an example of a first faith? Well, no one recorded had ever offered acceptable sacrifices to God. That's why he's an example here, because he was the first to do so. His faith was in the unseen. So faith is also, though, with Abel, a great example, because faith is something that you have to keep until the end. Right? It's something you have to hold on to, whether you're persecuted or whether it ends up in death. Because for Abel, doing what was right ended in his death. He was killed. Essentially for doing what God said, right? Cain killed him. And so faith ought to be like that. It keeps us connected to God unto death even. And then what a great way to... He doesn't say a whole lot about Abel, but Abel says a whole lot about himself. He's dead, but he still speaks. What a great thing to say. He speaks to us by his faith. He speaks to us by his example, as witnessed in the Old Testament record. Every one of these people are dead by the time this is written, but Abel died by the hand of his brother, and I suppose that's why he mentions it like that. But all of them speak through their death, example after example, very powerfully. Verse 5, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. So the word there, translated or taken or transposed or transferred, is actually the same word for changed. Now it's not the same word in the Greek, but compared to what happens to us, we shall all be what? 1 Corinthians 15:51, changed, right? So it's kind of interesting to compare that. That's actually the Hebrew word there, changed. Enoch's life was a life full of faith, a life in which he pleased God. His faithfulness was rewarded then by being changed, by being translated, by being taken up into heaven without first seeing, tasting death. How is Enoch an example of first faith? Well, he was the first one to do that. Even though, Abel's was kind of a negative example, Enoch's is a positive, still, he was the first one to do this, to go to God without dying. So Enoch is a great example of faith in the unseen. Now, verse 6 is a very vital verse that this chapter hinges on, and I want to talk about it. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. What does this verse mean? And why does the Hebrew writer pause here to say that before he goes on with another example? What's he saying?
To have faith is a must-have. You cannot please God without it.
That's right.
So you can't continue with God without it.
So maybe you're reading this chapter and you're thinking, I'm not Abel, I'm not Enoch, I'm not Abraham or Sarah, I don't have that kind of faith. He says, now wait a minute, before you think about that, you have to have faith just like them if you're going to please God too. Yeah, it's absolutely vital. What else? What do you see here?
Isn't it just a recap? Sometimes a speaker will say, okay, now, I told you this, we've gone over these things, but here, I'm going to just capsulize it.
Mm-hmm. We are taught in preach training camp, I don't know if I can get it right, but Wayne says, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. I mean, that's what you do, right? And so maybe it is just kind of a recap, a summarization. What else? What do you see? What stands out? Barbara?
You got to believe first that in God. You can't have faith in something you don't even believe in.
That's right. You got to believe in God. Trust in Him. John?
I think above all, it says that Christianity is not a passive religion, it's not a passive lifestyle, it's an active, involved, growing kind of lifestyle and faith.
Mm-hmm.
Just so out of this constant growing of faith and belief, you're going to come to even a stronger belief in God as you grow.
Yeah.
And then you're going to want to be with Him, or, as it says there, He will reward those who diligently seek Him.
Seek Him, yeah.
So there has to be this anticipation as well.
Yeah. These Hebrews were not like us, but I suppose in a lot of ways they were. A lot of Christians are very passive. We think Christianity is about coming and sitting and listening, right? That's the extent of our faith. But in a lot of ways, they become passive as well. And so it's not about being passive. It's about being active, about seeking and fulfilling that faith, acting on that faith. What else? Anything else? Verse 6. So if you remember, the Hebrew writer has often quoted Jeremiah 31. And so this is, in a lot of ways, the fulfillment of that predicted thing way back in Jeremiah 31. So what, the Hebrew writer's been talking about a lot of things. He's been talking about the Old Covenant. He's been talking about what's right. Jesus is greater. And then he kind of pauses for a second. And he says, would you consider this? What is the thing most pleasing to God? I mean, does God want sacrifices? Well, we would know based on what Jesus says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, right? What does God want most in my life? Does He want me to sing? Does He want me to pray? Does He want me to come to worship? He talked about that in chapter 10. That's important. What is the most important thing to God? He says, don't get this wrong. A life of faith. That's what pleases God. That's what matters to God. If you'll have that, guess what? You'll sing, you'll pray, you'll go to church, you'll do everything else you're supposed to do. But what matters most to God, what pleases Him, is to have faith. Faith in what? That He exists, but also that He rewards, and also that He rewards those who seek Him. Cain is, not brought up, but Cain is an example here in verse 6, because he sought to do it without the faith that Abel had, setting an example that religion of the flesh is nothing but sin. And so a person must believe in God, must believe that God exists, must believe that there is a reward to be had. And really, nobody wants to do anything without knowing what they're going to get for doing it, right? You don't go to work without knowing exactly how much you're going to get paid for however long you're going to work. And so God doesn't expect us to do what He asks us to do without knowing that there is a reward. And so we need to believe that God will reward those, not just those who know Him, not just those who believe in Him, but also have that relationship and that are actively seeking Him. Verse 7, by faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So Noah, even though he only gets one line in this chapter, is a really good example of faith in the unseen. As Judy had brought out, it had not rained before this happened. So Noah could have reacted, what are you talking about? I mean, that's never happened. I don't even know what that is. How is that possibly going to cause a flood of the world? But that's not how he reacted. He is a first to believe in a flood, to believe that God would destroy the end of all flesh. That's how Genesis 6 and verse 13 puts it. But I didn't see it till just now, but I suppose he's also the first to condemn the world. Did you notice that? By his actions, he condemned the world. I mean, obviously God condemned the world, but by doing what he did, he's also saying this is going to happen. And so he's the first to condemn the world as well. Noah had no sign, no visible sign of what was to come, the impending flood. Noah was told by God that there was a coming deluge 120 years before it occurred. Noah took that as fact, and he started building. He believed God, and he just did what God commanded.
Can you even imagine the world the way it was then? God says everybody was evil. And can you imagine the ribbing that he took for 120 years while he was building that thing?
Can't even imagine. The persecution would be heavy. Now Abraham, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So Abraham is not only the next example, but he's probably the example that's spent the longest time here in chapter 11. But Abraham is a great one because he had no Bible, right? He had no example to look to of faithfulness before him, at least in this exact area. No one had gone out not knowing like he did. So Abraham had faith in the unseen, not just the unseen of the physical land, but the spiritual one as well. And it's remarkable, if you think about it, the way the Hebrew writer puts it, that Abraham never actually received it. He never actually got the land of promise, except his burial spots. That's all he got to taste. That's all he got to have. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all co-heirs of the promise, and they never had a home. They never had a fixed place of habitation. They just moved from place to place, thinking about the place that they would finally rest. So they, as Abraham did, looked forward to the time that promise would be fulfilled.
I was just thinking, I want to go back to verse 7.
Yes.
For a second.
Sure.
And, we were talking about that that Noah did this. And, in the Beatitudes, we're told that blessed are we if people persecute us because of Jesus' name. And Noah was, and we are, a judgment against people. And they know it, and that's why people were persecuted.
That is a great reminder. I love that point. Noah we don't even know exactly a lot of the things that he said. He didn't necessarily preach to all these people, but Noah, just by obeying God, just by constructing the ark, is a judgment against the people. And so we, in the same way, and now we're supposed to preach, we're supposed to teach, but even if we don't, the choices we make, the lives we live, the examples we set, the way we dress, and the words we choose to use and not use, and every single thing we do is a judgment against other people, and that's often why persecution comes our way. Jerry.
I see in Noah as Abraham, they took not a negative, when he gave directions, they just sort of flowed with it. They didn't hesitate. And when that happened, it always had a good result.
That's right.
Moses had a little bit of hesitation.
Right, yeah.
He was quickly put in second place in some respects, but
Right.
They just took that as a direction. If it was directed that they do that, do this, or whatever it was directed, it seemed to follow. They followed it so to the letter.
That's right.
That the results was they knew
Yeah, that's right. Keith.
In this verse 7, do you think Noah had no idea at all of what was happening, or going to happen?
The flood, you mean?
It says that Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen. I wonder if that entailed telling him, you know, at least somewhat of what was really going to happen. But of course, he still had to have the faith to believe that it was going to work 120 years to make this start. But it seems like there's a possibility that he did know something.
Well, yeah, we wouldn't say Noah didn't understand anything. Just because he hadn't experienced a global flood doesn't mean he couldn't kind of picture it. You know, we read Revelation 21, right? Streets of gold, gates of pearl, 12 foundations. We don't know what that's going to look like. But he knows we kind of need something, right? And so maybe it's the same way he could picture, he could visualize the destruction that was about to come. In some means, I'm sure God tried to help him understand.
Genesis 6 says, God says to Noah, I'm determined to make an end of all flesh of the earth, etc., to make yourself an ark. So there was some basic knowledge. He didn't have intimate knowledge of how he was going to do it.
Well, you know, how is that going to look like? The end of all flesh. It's probably going to be pretty violent. It's probably going to be a mess, you know, and so he could imagine. Very good. Okay, let's read 11 through 16. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, Abraham, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they were seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Now, we don't have a lot of time for a lot of things, but we ought to at least make note that there are some women in this list. Sarah, Rahab, specifically the women of verse 35. Sarah, yes, the writer says was inspired by her husband's faith, but Sarah gets her own line. Sarah gets her own recognition of her faith in God. She believed God. So God obviously requires men to lead. He requires men for certain tasks. But we ought to stop and think, what does it mean that women are included in this list? Because God expects women to have their place as well. He expects women to have the same kind of faith that men are supposed to have. And so in that way, they are leaders in their own right. They are their own examples. They just have to play the role that God has for them. Now again, all these examples, well, at least these four that are listed here, they looked unto and paid heed to the unseen things. So the word all refers to Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Jacob. They were the ones, these were the ones who were promised great things. And he actually says they could have gone back. They could have gone back to their homeland if they had been so inclined to do so, but they preferred to remain strangers. They preferred to remain aliens and sojourners. Why? Because of their faith. Because of their faith in the unseen. So he uses this phrase, for they who say such things declared plainly that they seek a homeland. What a great little phrase, because that's us too, right? Our citizenship is in heaven. Isn't that what we're looking for? We're looking for a home. We don't belong here. We're just wandering. We're just sojourners. We're aliens. We're waiting for our homeland, and we're citizens of another place, of heaven. You know, the Hebrews, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Sarah, could have done. The Hebrews wanted to go back. They wanted to go back spiritually, but he's saying your faith is to keep you with God. So the readers have to have a confident faith in that same homeland, that same heaven, that same New Jerusalem, that it's going to be better than Canaan, the land that was promised. So in the same way, we need to see that as well. God has promised a heavenly city, a new Jerusalem, for all who are his children, whether that's Abraham, whether that's the readers of Hebrews, or us today. This city, prepared from the foundation of the world, before even the world was created, is the city in heaven where God is, and that's what we want. That's what we're looking forward to.
And,
Yes.
you know, they were moving forward and they had hit a rough spot, so they wanted to go back.
That's right.
As young people, how many of us do that?
Mm.
You know, you start out, mom, dad are waving about, lie to you, and you want it. You want it more than anything. And then you get scared.
Yeah.
And you think, well, I just better go back. But you know you can't, and you know that the future is out there. And so you trust all these things these people have told you to
Mhm.
be true. But you have to go.
Yeah, it's just you. You have to be the one to do it. It's a good example. Okay, let's finish up with 17 through 19. 17 through 19, again, Abraham, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Why does Abraham come up again? And how is he again an example of first faith? Any thoughts about that? Why is Abraham such an important example?
Kind of gives us an idea of what it could be. It's a lot of examples for us. That when God gave up Jesus, he had to die.
Yeah.
He was served the cross back to life. In a different way. And Isaac was not actually killed. The son, who was the son of Abraham. But it was that Jesus is alive.
So you think the Hebrew writers sort of pulling on that specific example, trying to maybe connect those dots? Hamilton?
Oh, I was just gonna say that, you know, this was the truest test of faith for Abraham, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because he had waited such a long, long time
Yeah.
to be granted and given this child.
And then God wanted to take it
And
away.
then God, you know, God wanted to test him and see if he would do what he was commanded.
Yeah, that's right.
I think it's key also that since Abraham is kind of the father of their nation,
Mm-hmm.
that he gets a little extra billing.
Yeah.
Plus it introduces Isaac as well.
Right.
And Abraham was a man that lived by faith.
Yeah.
And so what greater example than this one?
Mm-hmm. And he kind of deserves two spots because he had the great example of going out not knowing, but now the great example of offering up his son. So in verses 8 through 10, the point there is that Abraham did not lose his faith because he was looking for a heavenly Jerusalem. And so we, as the seed of Abraham, not Jews, but the church, are heirs of Abraham. We're also heirs of the same heavenly Jerusalem. So that was the point with that example. But now Abraham comes up again as an example because, well, no one had ever seen somebody come back from the dead before. And so Abraham is a first faith because he believed that God could do that. And so the Hebrew writer, I believe, tells us something we don't learn from Abraham's actual account, that what he was thinking, that Abraham thought God could raise him if I kill my son. So even though he didn't kill his son, even though he didn't get raised from the dead, that was what is Abraham's mind, and that's why he's a first to have done it, because he believed God could. Now, there were two specific areas that Abraham was tested. First of all, to overcome the love for his son. I mean, every parent loves their child, and there's just something between a dad and his son, and so he had to overcome that with a greater love for God. But secondly, to obey even when he couldn't see why. You just told me I'm going to have a son. This is my only son. I had him at 100 years old, and now you want me to kill him. And what sense does that make? But he doesn't question it, right? You said that, Hamilton. He believed God and that he would keep his word. Somehow, some way, even if I kill him, God will raise him back from the dead. I mean, he's going to figure it out. Abraham's faith was so strong that even in view of the fact that the promised blessings were all to come through Isaac, he's still going to sacrifice Isaac. So in a sense, the Hebrew writer tells us he did sacrifice Isaac. He did kill Isaac in a sense, because he built the altar. He bound his son. He laid him on the altar. He made ready the incense. He took his knife, and he was going to slay his son if God hadn't stopped him. And so in the sight of Abraham, Isaac was already offered up because he was determined to carry out God's command. And so, since Isaac was already dead, therefore God, in a sense, brought him back to life. And the lesson for us, obviously, is so very strong. Just do what God says. Even when you can't see the end, even when it doesn't make sense, even when you don't know how God's going to make it work, will you just trust that he'll make it work? Trust in his promises, and nothing less is going to be accepted by God. Nothing less will be pleasing to God, as he said back in verse 6.
So we need to apply that today, don't we?
Yeah, that's right.
Trust in God. He knows what's going to happen. And it'll happen, and it'll be good.
We've got a crazy world just in general, but you add to it, the virus, you add to it the political climate, you add to it all the problems, and we just look out and say, how is this going to work out? But we do. We need to have that same faith that Abraham had. So throughout this chapter are listed men and women of faith, and we learn from their faith. And we ought to spend a lot more time than we're going to do, but they've proved their faith by their action. And there's such great examples. We could learn that they could see something that could not be seen. That's what faith is. But we also have to realize that they were the first of their experiences. To me, that was my favorite point from this chapter, is that they were the first to do it, because somebody had to be the first. Somebody had to be the first. And these were the firsts. Have you ever thought, for you to have faith, somebody had to have faith? You didn't have to be the first. Somebody before you had faith, and somebody before them, and somebody before them, and somebody before them. And somebody was first. And somebody passed that down. Somebody decided that this faith is important enough to try to get you to have that same kind of faith. Abel was the first to offer acceptable sacrifices. Enoch was the first to skip death. Noah was the first to witness a global flood and the destruction of all people except his family. Abraham, the first to go out and not knowing. He was the first to sacrifice his son and witness God raising him from the dead, so to speak. And their faith was passed on. Their faith, especially with Abraham, is a great example. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, their faith was passed on. Their children, their children's children, and they implanted that solidly in those to come. So I think the thing I want us to remember as we go home tonight is we need to be thankful for those who had faith before us. But we need to be thankful for those that helped instill and build our faith. But let me also say this. Unless you are actively sharing that faith, this whole legacy, this whole line, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, your mother, your father, your grandparents, the elder, the preacher, whoever it was, that whole legacy of faith is going to stop with you. Unless you're doing the same thing. Unless you're actively going out and instilling faith in someone else, that legacy is going to stop with you. And you don't want that. You want to share your faith. You want to continue to pass on your faith. You want to continue this line of faith. Remember, somebody had to be first. Thankfully, that doesn't have to be you, but you don't be the last.